Hello and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In each episode, we interview a different scholar, thinker, or writer, asking them to help us myth bust commonly held assumptions about utopias and dystopias.
If you like what you hear, please let us know by following the podcast, rating it on Spotify, or dropping us a message on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. So, Matt, season 2, here we are, back with a bang. We're recording, once again, an episode of the Utopian and Dystopian Fictions podcast. How are you doing? How have you been? And have you had any life-changing changes in the interim 2 and a bit months since we last caught up?
Well, Liam, we're starting this series with an episode on apocalypse, and I've had my very own apocalyptic rupture or event in my life, which is the birth of my son. It's my first child, and I'm just very glad that this is a podcast so you can't see the bags under my eyes. But yeah, he's 3 weeks old. He was 2 weeks late, which was a lot of waiting around, but he's healthy and everything is going well aside from no sleep, but we're here. Yeah.
We are here.
Have you had any apocalyptic life-changing events?
I'm sorry to say no, not particularly. A bit of illness maybe over the Christmas break, but I'm sure your son in years to come will be thrilled to know that his first mention, perhaps online, will be that he brought an apocalypse to your life. I'm sure he'll be.
It's a positive. It's in the unveiling, the sense of unveiling. And you don't need to have an apocalyptic event just to feel like part of the group, Liam. There's a lot of apocalyptic events going around at the moment, so maybe you don't need another one.
Yeah. I'd like to sort of stay as far away from that group as is possible. But Matt, I guess you're saying, we've already given a sneak peek away about what today's episode is about. So I should probably let us know who joined us this time around, right, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will just say that as a prelude to this, we did agree. I think we talked about this in the Christmas episode, if that's what we can call it. And we said we were going to focus on dystopia a little bit more in this series because it was a bit utopia heavy, which I mean very positive. It was a great series for me. I enjoyed it. But yeah, we're going to go hard on dystopia in this series. So we have
Dr. Diletta De Cristofaro, who is an assistant professor at Northumbria University. Diletta was actually one of my external examiners for my Viva, so it was really love to hear from her again, albeit after the fact, as I've sort of been reviewing and will be editing the episode.
We had quite a long discussion. I've kind of lost track of what ended up being in the recording or other things we were chatting about, because we were chatting before and after for quite a while. And she did mention that she had examined your PhD, and she was quite fond of it. She thought it was quite good, Liam. So you're all right. You did okay.
Oh, well, I mean, if blushing makes a sound, if it did make a sound, I'm sure people would hear me blush at the moment. That's very kind. Diletta is a brilliant speaker. She is published quite widely on dystopias, maybe a little bit on like sort of dystopia, utopia, on the apocalypse and post-apocalyptic fiction, and a lot of sort of contemporary and modern lit too. And so she's a really sort of fascinating and brilliant speaker. And listening back to sort of the recording that the two of you made, the chat you guys had, I'm very jealous that I wasn't able to make it, Matt, because you had an absolute whale of a time.
Well, massive thanks to Diletta. I had a great, as you say, a great time interviewing her. It's one of those interviews where we've had some sort of passing interactions, via social media, and because we both, well, Diletta put together a special issue on Station 11, as you mentioned, and which I ended up getting involved in, and but yeah, I hadn't actually ever spoken to her in person, and I think it was a lot of fun. I felt like we had, as you say, a similar sort of background, which we only kind of discovered during the interview, which was nice. Yeah, I mean, other than just really, finding her very interesting and having slightly, I suppose, not different views to me on apocalypse, but like, so some interesting contrast came out, I thought. So that was one of the things I thought was interesting and very timely. I don't really think of myself as a scholar of apocalyptic fiction that much anymore because it was something that I did a lot, the early part of my career, and I kind of
Mm.
feel like I've tried intentionally to bury the early part of my career. But it was kind of interesting going back into that, and it feels very, very topical. And I don't know. I mean, it's something I'm teaching at the moment, so that was nice to sort of think about it, and I'm hoping that some of my students will download this episode of the podcast and or stream this episode of the podcast and might get something useful out of it. But yeah, I don't know, just I found it interesting, and the stuff she's working on now is really a bit different as well.
Mm.
So she's doing work on sleep and apocalypse, which again, as a new father, the connection between sleep or lack of sleep and apocalypse seems very pressing. But yeah, it sounds really interesting. So yeah, just
And
enjoyed it.
that reminds me as well, actually. When I was listening to sort of the chat you guys were having, and to let us talk about her current work about sleep and the apocalypse, I'll probably drop her an email anyway, just in case she doesn't hear this. Although Diletta, I'm sure you are listening. If she's looking for a recommendation that might be relevant to her current work, the novel Nod by Adrian Barnes is an apocalyptic novel about a crisis of sleep, published in 2012. So sounds super relevant to what she was doing. It reminded me of that. It's not a novel I've thought about for a while, but something that I hope to bring to her radar if it's not already on there.
We're going to talk about this new series quickly, and we didn't plug it. I wanted to
Mm.
plug and to say, please rate. What is it? What's your expression? Rate and follow, isn't it? That's
Something along
right.
those lines.
Not
Yes, I'm a bit out of
subscribe and
practice as well.
follow. Oh, I don't know. Subscribe and what's the
It's
YouTuber?
so YouTube would be like, comment, and subscribe, but we're not
Like,
on
comment, and
YouTube.
subscribe. That's it. That's it. So
But
do the equivalent. Rate and follow.
yeah, follow, rate, share. I guess it's not
Oh,
as
share. Yeah.
snappy. Yeah, share. You've got to get it out there. But yeah, I guess in all seriousness, if you're listening to podcasts, you're enjoying what you're hearing, you're thrilled to have myself and Matt and our guests plugged into your ears. Yeah, please do let us know. We do have an email address which is in sort of the episode descriptions and on the podcast description itself. You can let us know that way. There's a comment feature as well on Spotify, which I wasn't actually aware of for podcasts. So again, if you want to drop us a comment, maybe in a future episode we might do sort of letters from the audience or a segment along those lines. But yeah, ultimately, let us know you're enjoying it. Let us know, what topics you might want to hear us discuss or have guests discuss, and so on. Because yeah, we'd love to hear more from the people on the other end of the audio wave, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, it's the first episode back, so we didn't have much of a break. We had a little bit of a sort of wrap up and thought back of what worked and what didn't work, and we've got a few fresh ideas, I think, for this series, or this season. One of the things we're going to space it out a little bit more, partly because I've got a newborn, and you're doing this very much sort of in your sort of evenings and things like that. So episodes are probably going to be sort of 4 weeks to a month between them. And maybe that will help you keep up with us. But we've got some exciting guests lined up, and won't particularly spoil it. But one of those things, as I said, is we're going to certainly focus a bit more on dystopia this season. So that was where we're at with that. And so in that sense, do you want to talk about post-apocalypse for a bit before we roll the interview?
Yeah, cool. Yeah. I mean, I was saying to you before we started recording, I had a big reading slump last year. I was sort of new year, new me, all that sort of usual stuff. And reading and getting back into reading has been a really big one for me. And unintentionally, although as someone who is self-confessed dystopia junkie, I have read a handful of post-apocalyptic texts lately. and ones that I think are a bit less on the radar. So very recently, I read a book called Pink Slime by Fernando Trias. It's a Uruguayan novel, and it's about a sort of an ecological disaster in, I think it's a fairly unspecified part of Uruguay. Something Diletta said though in sort of your chat with her was, do we currently live in a time of permacrisis, of multiple concurrent crises at the same time? And when Diletta mentioned that, it made me think back to Pink Slime. And like I said, there's an ecological disaster that brings sort of really disruptive weather patterns, and sort of the end or the breakdown of civilization because of that. It's a horrible storm that's very dangerous and so on. But also within that, there's a lot of reflections on class, basically. And the sort of protagonist is a sort of a nanny, if you like, for a child in this coastal region, which is worst hit by this sort of this ecological crisis. Whereas the child's parents are very wealthy and live sort of way more inland, in a sort of much nicer conditions. So there is a sort of crisis of class underpinning that novel too. And there's a weird sort of medical crisis too, like the child that the protagonist nannies has this affliction where he just can't stop eating, which is a bit like me over the Christmas break. But this child is sort of, he's ravenous and he'll eat like anything and make himself like really dangerously ill doing that. So yeah, that's a really interesting text that I've read recently. I'm not sure if it's one that's come onto your radar at all, Matt.
I've not heard of it. No,
No,
but you've got me thinking about that kind of sort of, multiple overlapping
yeah.
crises and the kind of personal versus the kind of global, which you get in a lot of these texts. And I think again, we did discuss this, I think, very briefly in the interview, but I was thinking about Ling Ma's Severance, which is
Yeah.
just a wonderful novel. And it's really a kind of crisis, a work crisis novel to some extent, or it's about kind of work. But yeah, so we were discussing the kind of sort of artistic nature of kind of particularly in novel writing of the kind of post-apocalypse as a kind of vehicle for making sort of broader sort of social commentary and yeah, it sounds like this work Pink Slime is an example of that. I might check it out.
Yeah, I mean, sorry to add to your Goodreads to read list.
I mean, it's a pretty hopeless list at this point, so it's never gonna happen. But yeah, things get shuffled around depending on
Yeah,
what I'm interested in. So is that your would that be your recommendation as a
maybe less a recommendation and more just sort of Liam likes talking about dystopian texts from countries we wouldn't normally typically read from, right? We typically read very much in like the Anglosphere, and it's something that I've been doing a lot of lately, where I have been able to read is trying to move away from sort of the UK and North America. I have recently, only just this weekend, finished another novel, Under the Eye of the Big Bird by Hiromi Kawakami, which is literally, I think, just come out, published by like Granta Press or whatever their like publishing arm is, rather than the magazine. And that was really strange. And I know you just asked about recommendation, and I don't know if I do recommend this because it's either the best thing I've read all year or the worst thing I've read so far this year. And I can't actually decide which it is. And this is a post-apocalyptic novel that's told more in a sequence of short stories. And there has been some sort of unspecified apocalypse, and humanity is sort of really dwindled, and humanity is sort of surviving by maybe some sort of science fictional elements of, I don't know, sort of gene stuff or bringing sort of other animals into it. So it's sort of a weird blurring of like human and non-human going on in there, like cloning like strategies and so on. It's really unsettling. It has a very unclear chronology at times, and even order at times. But I think if I was to look at it with a slightly more thinky head on, it really reflects on sort of what does it mean to be human? That old chestnut, but what does it mean to be human? Where do we start and begin? Where does humanity start and end? Yeah, and a lot of sort of, I guess, like relationships, the importance of relationships, whether those are familial, paternal, or like romantic, and so on. Yeah, really fascinating. But just I can't get my head around if it's brilliant as a novel or really frustrating as a novel, but there's certainly lots to pick out from it.
I felt quite similar. I recently, well, not that recently. I suppose maybe a couple of years ago, I read Sequoia Nagamatsu's "How High We Go in the Dark." Are you
Mm.
familiar with that at all?
No, I know the name, but that's about as far as it. Yeah.
I felt the similar in that it was either brilliant or it was just, I mean, it was very out there. It was very odd. That's a kind of absurdist, surrealist post-apocalypse. Well, we kind of get the apocalypse occurs, so it starts slightly before the apocalypse, and that's a viral apocalypse. It's pretty gruesome in certain places because it's a viral apocalypse that particularly affects children.
Okay.
And so this really weird sort of commercial enterprise that sort of springs up that's basically like a theme park, that's end of life theme park where they literally there's a roller coaster that ends the kid's life. I mean, it's really quite grim.
Yeah.
um but yeah, there's a sort of absurdist nature to that text. Now I couldn't work out whether I liked it or not. But yeah, that sounds quite similar. Yeah, it's a sort of genre where I don't consciously think I'm consuming a lot of it, but when I look back, I seemingly have consumed an awful lot of kind of apocalyptic
Mhm.
fiction. I mean, teaching at the moment, as I said, an apocalyptic fictions module, which is a sort of survey module that sort of runs from all the way from like War of the Worlds,
Yeah. Yeah.
so the end of the 19th century into I think the most recent text I teach on it is Don't Look Up. So the um, Adam McKay movie, which I think is 2021, I would say, which I suppose is getting on a bit now, I suppose,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um, but yeah, so I mean that there's a lot of stuff that's really fun, and I actually really struggled to put that reading list together because I was thinking there's loads of stuff I was missing out. I mean, one of the texts we were talking about before we started recording was Children of Men, which is a
Yeah. Yeah.
great movie, a great novel as well, but I think more a great movie. And
Yeah.
I kind of want to put that on actually, but that hasn't managed to find a space. This year I was able to add Doctor Strangelove. There's a whole section of the module where we discuss kind of the Cold War and sort of nuclear anxieties. And that was something else I was thinking about before we started recording this episode as well, as I don't know if you noticed, but the doomsday clock was
Yeah.
reset at 89, weirdly specific, 89 seconds to midnight, which is the closest it's ever been. It's really interesting because the last sort of few years, post Trump in particular, they have I mean, it was always sort of political, but they've really politicized it
Mm.
by sort of making this point that we're now closer to midnight than we ever were, even during the Cold War period. I think maybe at sort of Cuban Missile Crisis time, it was about 3 minutes to midnight was about as close as it got. And now suddenly it's sort of, a minute and a half away from destruction. So yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. There, obviously indicates we're living in apocalyptic times to some
Yeah.
extent.
Yeah.
You'll probably know from the if you were listening to the other series, the earlier series, I've been writing a book on play in utopian and dystopian fiction, which I've just found out is now in production. It's slated for September
Hey.
2025, so this year. So maybe we'll be able to do something about it nearer the time, which would be nice. I know that we might be able to get some guests on to talk about that concept of play. But there's a section in it where I talk about the slow decline, because we tend to think of dystopias as quite exciting,
Mm.
violent kind of spectacle pieces, which I think we've talked about before on the podcast, actually. But when it comes to sort of post-apocalyptic texts in particular, we often get quite slow texts that don't
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
lot of action in. They're punctuated by some graphic violence every now and again, which kind of keeps you on your on edge. But in general, it's quite a slow process, and I'm wondering how much of that, particularly in recent years, is sort of mirroring our own sense that we're in a period of slow decline as a kind of a civilization, if we want to call it that. So that's something I've been quite interested in as well.
Well, Matt, I know that Diletta discusses temporality quite a bit in her interview with you. And so, how about we roll the tape and pass over to Diletta?
Hi, so I'm Diletta De Cristofaro. I'm an assistant professor at Northumbria University, and I'm a scholar of contemporary literature and culture. And I'm interested in particular in how cultural production engages with the idea of crisis and the many crises of our present. And so this is where my kind of work on post-apocalyptic fiction and dystopia more broadly comes in.
Just very quickly on that, sort of your focus is obviously on post-apocalyptic
Yeah.
fiction, and I quite often interchangeably use that term post-apocalyptic and apocalyptic fiction, which I think I feel a bit guilty about because there's obviously quite a big distinction. So I suppose apologies in advance if I start talking about apocalyptic fiction and you want to correct that. But do you see there being a great difference, or does it sort of vary?
I don't know, because to be honest, like, so obviously, like a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction in some ways ends up also being apocalyptic, because of course, in part, the disaster might play some kind of part in the plot. And so in that sense, often a post-apocalyptic novel is also inevitably apocalyptic, if you see what I mean. So I suppose the distinction is kind of like temporal. So in other words, is the plot taking place wholly after the disaster, or is there some sort of back and forth? And a lot of contemporary texts actually do a lot of back and forth. So I'll forgive you if you alternate between apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction. We're fine.
Okay, well, I'm already going to slightly adjust my next question because I was going to ask what
Oof.
drew you to up to writing about apocalyptic fiction, but I'm going to put what drew you to writing about post-apocalyptic fiction then.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I wrote a book about it, but that book, the contemporary post-apocalyptic novel, was originally my PhD thesis. So at the time in which I was starting to think about a PhD project, I was reading a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction, basically because it was kind of everywhere around me. This was around, 2009, 2010. And Cormac McCarthy had won the Pulitzer a few years before with The Road, which is obviously a post-apocalyptic novel. So there was a lot of attention being paid to the genre, both within the kind of literary establishment, but also, I suppose, outside of the literary establishment. And so in part, I was interested in thinking about, this fascination with the end of the world and why were so many people interested in end of the world scenarios at this point of time. But also something else that drew me to the genre was the kind of temporal aspects. So, something that I started noticing quite early on as I was reading these texts was that a lot of them were representing the future as a kind of return to the past. So this can be quite literal. So, there are some novels that, I don't know, represent a kind of post-apocalyptic future that is kind of neo-medieval, for instance. Something like The Book of Dave by Will Self is an example. But it can also be a little bit more metaphorical. So again, going back to The Road, this is a novel that basically represents a kind of like total breakdown of civilization, total breakdown of the social contract, basically. And so in a sense, it's a novel that represents the future as a very primitive kind of society, how we would potentially imagine a kind of primitive society. So something else that I was interested in thinking about was basically, why do these novels think about the future as a return to the past? And why, again, is this happening at this specific moment of time? So these were the kind of elements that drew me to the genre when I first started thinking about it.
It's really interesting. I mean, weirdly, there's a sort of synergy between my own career
Yeah.
because I was doing my PhD. I think I started in 2010. No, I think it was 2009 as well. So it's exactly the same time. And my PhD was also in apocalyptic fiction, although
Yeah,
it was
of course.
film.
Yeah.
So I was so I think my project started as being I was very uh troubled, I think is probably the right word, by that quote that's probably quite famous now. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of
Mm,
capitalism, which
yeah.
is sometimes attributed to Zizek, but I can only ever find it written in Frederick Jameson's
Yeah.
Archaeologies of the Future. So I'm gonna give it to Jameson. But that's always bothered me throughout my entire career. And as soon as I sort of read that, I think I read it as an undergraduate, and I thought, okay, um, it seems like a quite sort of simple, trite statement, but I suppose as now I would kind of look at myself as to some extent a utopianist. It really
Mm,
bothers me that we have to kind of imagine, blowing everything up in order to think about something
mm,
else or something different.
yeah,
So that was kind of what drew me to the subject. But I was obviously focused on film, and I think one of the things that was interesting to me at the time, looking back now, is PhDs change.
yeah,
They're never quite what they start out as. And I started writing about apocalyptic film, but I ended up being fascinated by September 11, and so I ended up looking at post-apocalyptic sort of text, post 9/11. So in some ways, it sounds very similar.
yeah,
And at the moment, I'm teaching an apocalyptic fictions module, which does cover sort of literature and film. Um, and one of the questions that I kind of ask or try to ask is, we're actually into week 2 of the module now, but last week I was sort of asking, well, why study these texts?
mm,
And I think there's quite a lot of value in them. They're obviously very historically contingent, so we
yeah,
learn a lot about the passage of time by considering, apocalyptic fictions which reveal the anxieties of an age, perhaps. So I
yeah,
think, it's interesting that one of the things you're talking about then is this is a very specific moment. And I'd
yeah,
be kind of also interested to know whether you think that moment is continuing, or whether, if you wrote the book in 2018, published 2019,
yeah.
is it still that, are we still in that moment, or have things changed? But also they're like existential, aren't they? They're partly about the human condition.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what was interesting about that moment specifically was the fact that basically, McCarthy, because again, he won the Pulitzer for this novel, and because, of course, he was a novelist that we don't really associate with science fiction, a lot of writers that are not science fiction writers started to write, post-apocalyptic novels because of him. So, for instance, I'm thinking about somebody like Emily St. John Mandel, who writes Station 11 in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And she explicitly says that McCarthy gave her permission, that's the word that she uses, to work in the post-apocalyptic genre. So in a sense, what my book ended up being about was about that moment in which a lot of non-science fiction writers were taking up this genre, basically. And I think to an extent it is continuing, like in a sense, in the sense that it is still a very popular genre beyond science fiction. Um, but obviously something that I think we'll see a lot more of, and it's actually something that I've started to think in terms of my future work, is the idea of the permacrisis or polycrisis, these kind of like two words that have started being used in the past, I don't know, a couple of years maybe, with COVID especially. So this idea that the contemporary moment is a moment of interlocking crisis. And so I think that we're going to see more and more post-apocalyptic novels that actually take up this idea of interlocking crisis, and how do we actually navigate that. So for me, it's going to be interesting to see how the genre responds to this conjuncture, right? Because of course, part of the point of the polycrisis or permacrisis is that, in a sense, the apocalypse is kind of endless, and it's a kind of accumulation of things. And so it inevitably means that the very notion of apocalypse is going to change, because we tend to think about the apocalypse as a very specific moment in time, right? That has specific consequences. So yeah, that's what I assume is going to happen. And a lot more writers are going to pay attention to this kind of idea and come up with interesting variations on the genre.
Yeah, I suppose how you destroy the world sort of says something about your
Yeah,
agenda. And
absolutely.
thinking about sort of that idea of sort of permacrisis, there's also, I suppose, like one of the things that McCarthy does, and that has been done by other writers as well, is he obscures what
Yes.
causes that
Yeah.
crisis. So to some extent, you don't date your work because
Yeah.
it's not tied to a particular event, do you? So
Yeah.
maybe that's why that sort of text will be one of those kind of lasting
Yeah.
sort of iconic novels, because you can't tie it to a particular event. Is it a nuclear disaster? Is it a climate disaster? He kind of leaves these questions up in the air.
Yeah. Somebody else that does that very well is Jim Crace in The Pest House, which is another one of my favorite post-apocalyptic novels, which is set about probably 2000 years after the disaster. And again, we don't know what happened. There is no way of knowing. I even went to the archives at the Harry Ransom Center, because they have the archives of Jim Crace, and there is nothing about it.
I mean, yeah, it's kind of worse if the author sort of tells you what it's about, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's always a bit disappointing. Students tend to love the idea that the author is going to tell them what the text is about. I can't think of anything worse. I'm drawn to this quote by Frank Kermode from The Sense of an Ending, which is what human need can be more profound than to humanize the common death. When we survive, we make little images of moments which have seemed like ends. We thrive on epochs. This sort of sense that actually we need apocalypse. We kind of need these ruptures in our lives in order to make sense of those lives, and sort of shows, I suppose, the multi-layered nature of apocalypse. So we're talking about it here as the end of the world, but in other ways it can be talked about as rupture points, maybe. I mean, we had a little bit of a break because I just had a child, my first child, and so that it to some extent feels like an apocalyptic moment for me. A moment of rupture in my life. My sleeping patterns have been destroyed and upended. So it's quite a sort of flexible, fluid idea, and that can be used in lots of different ways. Does all the stuff you write about focus on the end of the world, or are there other sort of elements that you bring into this?
I mean, so obviously, like by definition, post-apocalyptic fiction, something ends and something continues, right? Even in the road, although of course we don't know how long that world is going to survive for, there is something that is still alive from the past world, and there is something else that is being that is born, basically, this kind of like very bleak everybody against everybody else world. But I suppose what is interesting to me about that quote by Kermode, because my thesis was titled actually Beyond the Sense of an Ending. So obviously Kermode was for me quite an interesting theorist to think with, because I think that he's obviously absolutely right that the end is a way in which humans have made sense of time. This is like the very core of the traditional apocalyptic logic, which is basically about an ending that makes sense of everything that comes before. That's how time is ordered by apocalypse. But to me, what's interesting about contemporary post-apocalyptic fiction is that it actually kind of doesn't do that the end doesn't make sense of what happened before. So that's why I think that these novels are doing something different from the traditional apocalyptic understanding of time. And a lot of my book is about trying to trace this shift, in a sense, in how we understand apocalypse, and how these novels understand apocalypse as not an ending that makes sense of things, but if anything, like an ending that reveals, in a sense, that nothing makes sense, and that a series of constructions that we've had are actually not bringing about any kind of utopia, but the exact opposite, right?
There's no revelation. Oh, that's really interesting. So these sort of texts imply kind of meaninglessness to contemporary life, or?
I think so, in a sense, but I also think, not just meaningless, but more, I guess, they're trying to warn us against they're trying to warn us basically about the idea that, history is directed towards betterment, which is, again, very apocalyptic, right? The apocalyptic understanding of time in its origins is about this utopian revelation, as you were mentioning, right? That's the etymological meaning of the word apocalypse. And what these novels do, they kind of expose, in a sense, just how much modernity has been shaped by this apocalyptic understanding of time. And they try to show how this in turn as very dangerous legacies in our present. So one of the things that I do in my book is basically thinking about how ideological constructions that are core to modernity, like progress, like colonialism, like capitalism, are all very much informed by a traditional apocalyptic understanding of time. And all of these novels that I work on my book are actually trying to work against those ideas, specifically by showing just how damaging they are. You know, something like the climate crisis is very much the product of all these kind of like constructions that we have in modernity, and that actually have really bad consequences in our present.
Is that a streak of sort of anti-utopianism then, do you think, in these texts?
I think so, yes. I think so. The idea is basically that whoever comes up with a utopian end ultimately is deciding what kind of utopian vision we should aim for, and that is by definition kind of dangerous. So I think that there is, in a sense, a streak of anti-utopianism in these novels. Yeah, definitely. Which I mean, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about, because I know that obviously you come to it from a very different perspective. So
well, it's funny you should say that. I mean, I was going to ask you a bit later, but I might jump to it now about Station 11, because I first had some contact with you, Diletta,
yes.
as you were putting together a special issue on Emily St. John Mandel's novel for Open Library of Humanities, which is a really great special issue, I think. You know, all of the papers are really interesting.
Including yours.
Well, I mean, you know, it's okay. I like, you know, I enjoyed writing the novel. So I think actually I was quite cheeky. If I remember correctly, I think you may have contacted me asking me to review a piece.
Oh, really?
And yeah, I think you contacted me. This is going to paint me in a really bad light. So I suppose Leah might edit this out.
I do not remember that at all.
I think you asked me to review a piece.
Right.
And I reviewed it and didn't like it, but I reviewed it and didn't like it, but it's prompted in me an idea, and I thought, but you know what, I've actually got a really good idea for a piece on this, because I'd read the novel in preparation for reviewing it. I hadn't actually read the novel, but I think you caught me at a good time over the summer, and I sort of had space for it, and I just thought the novel was brilliant, and I thought, oh, this, you know, there's so many good things you could do with this novel. So I think it was a paper that I wrote in about 2 weeks, because you'd sort of extended a deadline for me.
I mean, I thought, you know, the only thing I remember is that it was an excellent paper, so I do
right,
not remember this backstory.
But one of the things I remember about it is that I remember your paper as almost arguing the exact opposite of what I was arguing,
Yes.
which I thought was fascinating. And both were, I thought, you know, very convincing readings of the text. And I often talk about that sometimes to my students, you know, that you can absolutely produce, you know, counter readings that seem contradictory, but both are persuasive, you know, if you're providing the right evidence. So yeah, so I think I take a much more sort of utopian view of Station 11. I found when I put the book down, it gave me a kind of warm feeling, you know, that I felt it had hope, it had optimism. It was much more. I mean, unlike a lot of those kind of post-apocalyptic texts that you get, where the focus is on the struggle for survival in the immediate aftermath, I think you know a lot of what takes place in Station 11 takes place, I think 50, I want to say 10 or 15. I think it's 15 years after the apocalyptic scenario, and so it's therefore more about recovery than it is about kind of that horrible stuff. And I think the characters have you know knives tattooed on them for how on their wrists or whatever, for how many people they've had to kill. So there's this kind of silent sort of acknowledgement that this time, you know, the preceding decade or more was difficult, and you had to go through this stuff, but it was more focused on this kind of uplifting utopian, you know, formation of communities, revival of art, than it was on that kind of disaster. But you kind of interpreted it in a quite contrasting way, I thought, in your piece.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that, because actually the only time that I've taught the novel, I remember actually assigning bits of both your article and mine precisely for the same
Right.
reason, because they were quite different interpretations, right? So I thought it was going to be interesting for the students to actually see that kind of like complete opposite, or no, I'm not sure I would say complete opposite, but you know, like different interpretations of specific moments within the text, right? Because I think that, I mean, I absolutely agree with you that obviously it's a lot, like Station 11, it's a lot less bleak, right, than a lot of other contemporary novels. Like it's contemporary post-apocalyptic novels, obviously. It's a novel that actually does a lot with the beauty of the post-apocalyptic landscape, for instance, which is not something that you necessarily see, right, in a lot of these fictions. But I think that our different interpretations kind of more hinge on that final moment of the novel, which, I mean, I'm not going to say much about, because, you know, in case people haven't read the novel and would like to read the novel, obviously it's not a good idea to
And
give
they
away
should.
the
It's a
end.
brilliant novel, right? It's a
It
brilliant
is a
novel.
brilliant novel. Everybody should read it. I think it's a really, really great novel. It's a really interesting take on the post-apocalyptic genre. I think it's quite fresh. So, you know, if you're a fan of the genre and want to read something that is a little bit different, I would definitely recommend that novel. But yeah, I think that for me, again, without going into too much detail about the ending, it's not that the ending isn't hopeful, but it's more that there is that sense of like openness that in a sense doesn't allow that sense of an ending to work, if you see what I mean. Like it's an open, it's a wondering, it's a speculation about what's going to happen, right? You know, the character that is articulating those kind of reflections at the end doesn't know actually what's happening. And so in that sense, I wouldn't say necessarily that it's a utopian ending. I would just say that it's an ending that leaves everything open, and therefore that by definition, it's not an apocalyptic sense of an ending, if you see what I mean, because it doesn't make sense of everything that comes before anyway. And in fact, that, you know, a lot of the novel is about troubling, in a sense, that kind of like teleology to time that says, oh, you know, this event happened and therefore everything else before makes sense. I think that's where my reading comes from. So I'm not saying that, you know, it's a wholly dystopian ending, but I'm also, I would hesitate to call it, you know, a kind of utopian opening as well, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ending's really interesting. I'd seen it read also as a kind of colonial,
Yes.
which I think is a really
Yes.
smart reading, and it does take the gloss off it a bit. I think it's almost an
Yeah.
accident that that's
Yeah.
in there. I don't think that's the intention of the
Yeah.
author at all. But
No.
I quite like the ending in terms of it. I thought it was quite hopeful because the character involved is a character that throughout has been quite you buried in nostalgia and in the past, and you know it's a character that creates this museum of civilization which seems to acknowledge you know sort of defunct technology and stuff like that, and he's always looking backwards, but in that moment he, you know, is prompted, spurred by something else which, you know, again won't give away, but to look forward, and maybe imagine something new and something else coming out of it.
But is it something new? And that's again where
Or,
I think that we
something old. I mean,
diverge, because I think that in a sense, actually, what he sees kind of suggests a repetition of the same
yeah,
destructive elements that are
that's
brought
true.
to the apocalypse in the first place. And so
That's that
that's
colonial
again,
reading definitely, you know, conforms to your to what you're thinking there. Yeah, yeah.
so,
There you
so,
go.
so, so yeah, so that's another element that for me kind of, yeah, does not suggest fully that, yeah, that utopian ending. But again, it is, I mean, I think that in part, you know, it is an ambiguous ending, and it is ambiguous by design, and I think that that's why it affords so many different interpretations.
It's Station 11 as well. Just while we're on it, is one of those texts that I think, you know, shows that that importance of contingency, or contingent readings of text, because it was published in 2014. I think you're right on
Yeah.
that, and obviously that's pre-COVID,
Yes.
and it exploded in popularity, I think, around that sort of COVID period.
Yeah.
In fact, you know, oddly, it seems to be the only article of mine that I've written that anyone's ever read. So yeah, it seems to have had lots of hits. So I think it was,
I'm
as you're
sure
writing
that's
about,
not true.
well, I think, as you're writing about contemporary things, sometimes you write about something just at the right time before it takes off, and I think that's maybe what happened with that. And yeah, I remember I teach it on my utopian and dystopian fiction module, and I was teaching it
Yeah.
during the moment of the pandemic, and it was
Oh
really
gosh.
interesting because I think everything was being shut down in sort of March, April, and that was about week 7 or 8 for us, which is I was literally, it was, I think, maybe the week or 2 weeks before we actually ended up moving to online teaching, because we could. So, and the students were freaked out by it, like really freaked out by it, and I see it as quite this positive, uplifting novel, and I had taught it before the pandemic kicked off as well. So I taught it the year before, I think maybe even the year before that, but certainly for a year before. And that, students had liked it. It didn't have the same, just didn't have that that same effect on people. It really did sort of catch people by surprise. And
You know what? You've completely unlocked a memory, which again I had completely removed, which is that basically the same thing happened to me. Again, that module that I taught, I think only once or maybe twice, that had Station 11 on it. We were also supposed to be doing it basically in, I don't know, say March 2020 or April 2020. And by that point, my university had already moved online. And I was actually quite scared about teaching it because I thought, oh, this is
too close to home.
Yeah, it's awkward. I don't know if the student, but what happened was that the students absolutely did not turn up for the class, so I guess they didn't like it.
Oh, right. Yeah, maybe that, we'll give them a pass on that one, maybe, shall we? Yeah. I'm teaching The Plague tonight, actually. I've got my MA classes in the evening, 6 till 9 p.m. Yeah, that's another novel that seems to have come back into fashion because of the pandemic. And but it's a great novel. I really like Camus' The Plague. It's really interesting, but it does sort of one of the things that, so I suppose it leads me up to another question I had here, which was is apocalyptic fiction, in your mind, or post-apocalyptic fiction, is it radical or is it like compensatory? And that's partly my interest in
Yeah.
utopian thinking coming through in that question. What's your take on that?
Yeah. So I guess, in its origins, paradoxically enough, because again, it was intertwined with this idea of a utopian revelation, and of a revelation of something that would make sense of everything that came before. Apocalypse was a compensatory story. It was, if you think about the most fundamental Christian apocalyptic text, which is the book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse of John. It was written at a time in which Christians were persecuted. And so it was a vision of better things to come, right? So originally it was a comforting narrative. It was a compensatory narrative in that sense. And I guess that for some people, it could still be that, because, it could be that you're reading all of these horrible things and they ultimately make you feel better about your life, because, things could always be worse. But I definitely don't think that that's what the authors are trying to do. I think it's fairly safe to assume, because again, the interviews that we have with these writers, that what they're trying to do is something different. I think they're trying to warn us. I think they're trying to, teach us or make us reflect about, specific aspects of the world, of our present, of the world that we inhabit. I think so in that sense, it is a genre that has radical ambitions, I would say. Whether those lessons are heeded or not, it's of course an entirely different matter. It's the same thing as with science fiction, that famous thing about people like Musk reading science fiction and taking all the wrong lessons from it, and actually thinking that there are plans for the future, rather than actually fictions that are trying to warn you that specific things should not happen. This is an entirely different question, right? But I do think that it is a genre that has radical ambitions. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it kind of varies. So there is obviously an element of apocalyptic fiction, post-apocalyptic fiction as well. That is quite. I mean, I'd put this as a kind of question early, but quite lowbrow, you know, it's quite trashy or pulpy or like exploitative. So in that sense, you know, when I was talking about my PhD, one of the things I was looking at particularly was like the pre post 9/11 pre 9/11, not pre post 9/11. Getting too many posts in my brain here, but the pre 9/11 sort of 1990s apocalyptic movies. There's like a wave of like tons of movies, particularly from sort of 1995 up to like sort of 1999, sort of a bit of a kind of fin de siècle sort of moment of our own, um, which are really trashy. Like, you know, so you got Independence Day, which actually is one of the lesser of the trashy ones. End of Days, Arnold Schwarzenegger, um, um, Armageddon, Godzilla. These kinds of movies were sort of really popular in the box office and absolutely do not treat apocalypse with any kind of seriousness. They're a kind of vehicle for you know, American heroism. They're a kind of symbol of that kind of the post-Cold War American triumphalism, and they're quite kitschy. And so it can do that. It can absolutely be quite lowbrow, not that serious, definitely not radical. You know, if anything, those texts, interesting enough, kind of celebrate, you know, America as it was in that moment. That, you know, in order to save the world, there has to be something worth saving, right? Otherwise, why bother? So they're almost the opposite of kind of radical in my mind. At the same time, you know, particularly post 9/11, you have a lot more of these kind of thought-provoking texts, as you say, that are kind of critical dystopias that, you know, are teaching or warning us about things. They're often anti-heroic, they're artsy, they're serious. You know, The Road, as you suggest, is a good example of that. And you know, that kind of you know, the unserious, kitschy, exploitative stuff doesn't go away entirely. There's still sort of Roland Emmerich still tries to bring it back every now and again, in movie terms. But certainly, I think in terms of sort of novels, I think, you know, it's actually more highbrow now. It's much more of a kind of, yeah. I think you're right to see that, and that might be the difference between me looking at it from a kind of movie perspective compared to a novel perspective.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely very interesting what you're saying because yes, movies, there are a lot more examples that I can think of, yeah, as you say, just, you know, jingoistic movies basically about, America, or even like, you know, masculinity and the kind of like, masculine models kind of like saving the world, etc. So yeah, they're not, and you know, and they're fantasies that basically are there to, you know, reassure people of certain values and certain ideas. But when I think about fiction, I have more issues coming up with those kind of examples. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a difference in terms of like which medium we're actually talking about.
Yeah, I suspect, you know, being very kind of boring about it, I suppose, and thinking quite literally, um, movies cost a lot of money, particularly apocalyptic movies where, you know, budgets for special effects tend to be enormous. You've often got big name actors, and as a result, you're quite risk averse, aren't you? And you go down the route of kind of the Hollywood popular, you know, happy endings and things like that. So perhaps you know, I thought the adaptation of The Road by John Hillcoat was actually really quite well done. You know, I actually, it is one that sort of really sort of maintains that integrity, resists the sort of temptation to make this a kind of spectacle in some way, and it's really grim and grimy and like, you know, bleached and yeah, it's gritty. I liked that, and I thought, you know, that was a strong adaptation for that, but that's unusual, I think.
Yeah, but
In the
it is
genre.
because it's an adaptation, right? So, you know, I think that completely aligns with what we were talking about. Although again, I mean, I completely agree with you. It's a really good adaptation. The ending, though, again, it's, you know, if you compare the ending of the novel with the ending of the movie, there is an interesting kind of like change in, so like as with the novel, the movie is very grey, right? Because that's the kind of like tonality that McCarthy describes throughout the novel. But then at the end of the movie, you get a shift to colour, which I found interesting as a kind of like specific interpretations of an ending that is again very open.
Is a happy ending? Is it a more upbeat ending than the novel provides?
I think so. Yes, I think the novel, you know, if you read it very, very closely, it's not that hopeful at all.
No. It's one of the bleakest novels I've ever read.
Exactly. The movie, I mean, I'm not saying that the movie, you know, is a full happy ending, but it is interesting that there is a shift to color, because obviously it is trying to, you know, to suggest hope.
So, yeah, I wanted to work towards sort of just thinking about, well, what's on the future for you. So maybe, you know, if you don't mind answering what you're currently working on, projects that are currently ongoing.
Yes. So I'm currently kind of like wrapping up a project on the writings of the sleep crisis, which is this idea that basically contemporary society is chronically sleep deprived, which I'm sure at this moment in your life you feel a lot.
Yeah, I'm already putting this in my Amazon basket. You know, absolutely chronically sleep deprived. Yeah.
Exactly.
Sleep apocalypse.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, the project in general is basically investigating what contemporary writings have to say about this crisis. So I've worked on a lot of different genres and media. So for instance, I've done some work on sleep tracking apps alongside fictions. But yeah, interestingly for, you know, this podcast and the audience, is that even in this project, I've managed to sneak in some kind of post-apocalyptic stuff, because actually the project itself, in part originated from the fact that as I was researching for my book on the contemporary post-apocalyptic novel, I found out about this really bizarre, kind of like odd subgenre of post-apocalyptic fictions that I call the sleep apocalypse novel, in which basically the end of the world is about a catastrophic pandemic of a sleep disorder. It's mainly insomnia, so in a kind of exaggerated version of insomnia in which people stop sleeping altogether and therefore they die. And so in part, the project was born from trying to think about why at this specific moment in time, we could see a lot of these very apocalyptic visions of sleep emerging. It can't just be about parents not sleeping, right? It must be about something else. And so that was, the origins
sort
of the
hyper
project.
capitalist sort of, you know, you're always sort of, yeah.
Switched on.
Is Severance, Ling Ma's novel, is that something you touch on in that? Or at all? 'Cause
No.
it's kind of not exactly about sleep, but
Yeah, because it's not about sleep, but actually Severance was, you know, when you were talking about Station 11 as a kind of like prescient novel in terms of COVID, I was actually thinking about Severance, right?
Yes.
Because that was the other novel that all of a sudden everybody was talking about, because it was, so clearly mapping onto
But it's also
what was
great. Not
happening.
both of these are
It's
great
such
novels.
a great novel. Such a great novel. I love it. Yeah, absolutely. So no, and actually I haven't written about it, although, yeah, it's a novel that I really, really like, because you know, it didn't, by the time that I finished my book, you know, I don't know if it was already out or, you know, it had just come out, so I couldn't really fit it into the book.
2018. So, I mean,
Yeah.
you would have been very, you're working up to the last minute on that book if it was in there. Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't quite fit with the new project, but it is a novel that I often think about because I really did enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually wrote a piece relatively recently on Severance and
Oh,
The
really?
Last of Us. Yeah, which is available and very kindly is available open access thanks to
amazing.
some funding that the editors received. So yeah, it's something I quite like.
I'll check that out.
Yeah, have a look. Might be interesting to you. Okay, brilliant. Well, as a sign off, I've been asking guests what's a text, could be a novel, could be a movie, could be a piece of criticism, usually about utopia, because the first series was seemingly accidentally all about utopia, but I think definitely this time about dystopia or about apocalyptic fiction that everyone you think should read, that doesn't include your own book, which they absolutely should read. But
thank you. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about an example of a very good sleep apocalypse novel then, because I think it's one of those kind of scenarios that people, you know, might not have encountered, even though they're a fan of post-apocalyptic fiction, so it might be something that people might be interested in. And it's a really brilliant novel. It's called Sleep Donation by American writer Karen Russell. And it's set in a very near future in which basically there is a pandemic of terminal insomnia. So again, people stop sleeping and they die from this constant state of vigilance. And the protagonist works for an organization that has come up with a treatment. And as the title suggests, the treatment is about a donation or a transfusion of healthy sleep to the people affected by the disorder. But obviously things are not as simple as that, so I'm just going to leave it at that. But the reason why I recommend it is that, well, first of all, it's really well written. It's just a great novel. But also it's a really interesting kind of like exploration of how sleep can become a resource under capitalism. It's a brilliant exploration of the ways in which we value or devalue sleep. And it's also a book that traces a lot of telling and revealing, if we want to go back to this idea of a traditional apocalypse, revealing parallels between the idea of a sleep crisis and the climate crisis. So the ways in which, we devalue sleep kind of parallel the ways in which we devalue nature. And so, yeah, I highly recommend it. Sleep Donation.
Really interesting. Going on my lengthy Goodreads list, which just grows and grows and grows. But that sounds great. Really interesting. And thanks for coming on, Diletta. It's been wonderful to have you.
Thank you for having me. It was such a great chat.
What a way to kick off the second season of the Utopian and Dystopian Fictions podcast. We are really grateful to have had the chance to speak with Diletta and to hear her insights on all things apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic, her personal research journey with the genre, and her present fascinating work on the sleep crisis. If you enjoyed this episode, please do let us know. You can rate and follow the podcast, write a comment on our episodes, and you can even get in touch by emailing utopiananddystopianfictions@gmail.com. Please join us again next time, where we'll explore even more utopian and dystopian fictions.